I lost
Are
my,
recording.
okay, let me get my full image up. Just give me a second here. Okay, there we are. Okay, trying to get Amanda on.
You see me?
Yeah, now I see you. Now I see you. Okay, very good. Okay, we're ready to go. Hi, Amanda. Wonderful to talk to you again. I'm holding up your terrific book, which we're going to be talking about tonight. It is really a superb book on every possible level, including, of course, its production. And it was
gorgeous,
published by our publisher and the best in the country, if not the world, Alfred Knopf, and our editor is here tonight, Vicki Wilson. So this is a beautiful job of editing and writing. But I want to ask you, Amanda, this was the third time you went back to the well with Jerome Robbins. I usually, after I'm done with the project, I feel I've lived with the subject and I'm sort of ready to move on. But obviously you didn't feel that way about Mr. Robbins. You wanted more time with him. Am I right?
That is an absolutely strange thing, because I also generally feel that I'm done when I'm finished. I feel I've done this. It's finished. I did the best I could, and onwards. Let's go on. Something about him, something about the subject matter, the time he lived in, the people he knew, and his own. He was although I hope that I got him. He was elusive in a lot of ways, and he was one of these people who I felt did not reveal himself easily to other people. And as a result, I kept wanting to go back and say, there was so much when I wrote the biography of him that I was published in 2006. I felt that I had to cut so much, I had to leave out so much. There was so much that I couldn't include. Specifically, I couldn't really include too much of his own voice. And the thing I found so surprising about Robbins was that he was, when I began that biography, I thought he was a choreographer, he was a director. He was not someone I would necessarily have thought of as a writer. I didn't think I was going to have masses of written material to excavate. And as it turned out, there were something like, 100 linear feet of 300 linear feet of files, letters, diaries, memoranda, fiction, all kinds of scenarios.
But did you have access to that file when you did the original biography?
Well, I did. I had. All of those files were the basis of my work originally. But you can't put everything into a biography. You wouldn't want to. People wouldn't want to read it. And the other thing is, as a biographer, as I used to tell my own writers, I would want the writer's voice. The writer needs to assess the subject. You need to hear from what is the writer, what kind of context is the writer putting on it? What's the story that needs to be told here? So a lot of the time, you can't listen to the subject, then it's the subject's book. It's not the.
I feel that way very strongly. I once had a teacher colleague who said, my students think of me as somebody who has no opinions. And I didn't understand that as an approach to pedagogy, and I certainly don't understand that as an approach to biography. I want to know what you, as a biographer, think of your subject personally and professionally. And I want your voice and your opinion.
Absolutely. And when I was an editor, I would say to writers who I was working with, particularly with biographers, they would come in and there would be pages and pages and pages of people's letters or their diaries or whatever. And I would say, look, this is all fascinating, but what do you think about it? That's what I want to know. I did not buy a book by so-and-so. I bought your book about so-and-so.
Exactly.
So that's what I did. But the thing was, I kept feeling as if, I didn't do justice to him because there are all these things. No one knows that he thought this or that he said that, or there would be turns of phrase that you would think, well, most important, there were so many people who knew Robbins, knew him quite well, worked with him over and over, who thought he was inarticulate. They would say, oh, you know, words were Jerry's enemy. And I thought, how could you say that? I read all of this stuff. And
he's remarkably articulate,
yes,
remarkably.
yes. And so when I was asked, after I finished that biography, I was asked by Judy Kenberg, who was a producer and director at WNET, if I would collaborate with her on a documentary about him for American Masters. And I had never written a screenplay before, but she asked me would I do it, and she just said, "Look, you know everything anyone could possibly know about this subject, and you have a good narrative sense, so you can do this." And so I did. And again, what we were doing a lot of the time was using Robbins's own words, narrated in the end gorgeously by Ron, beautiful connective material to try to tell the story of this complex man. And again, I kept thinking, God, there's so much I can't use. So it haunted me. There were all these things. I kept thinking, I didn't use this. I'm a cook, and I'm a thrifty cook. I like to use everything. You know, it's like nose to tail cooking. You don't want to leave the entrails behind if they're interesting or good. So I felt like I left all of this. I left the entrails. I didn't, you know, you need to see the entrails.
But I just reread the book pretty carefully to prepare again for our talk tonight. And it's hundreds and hundreds of pages long of Robbins in his memoirs, his diaries, his letters, and he holds the attention page after page after page. You're interested in what he has to say. You're interested in who he is. What is fascinating is, and I'm sure you know this, his reputation is that he was one of the villains of the American theater. People hated him.
Many people did.
Many people really hated him. I've talked to people, if you mention his name, they become empurpled. They truly despised him. But you read this book and you see that there was a person behind that difficult facade. And they're not necessarily connected. So there was a private self and a public self.
And that too was one of the things that I think drove me back again and again to him, was that here is this person about whom so many people had an opinion. Often it was an opinion based on something they'd heard. A lot of the time it was an opinion based on having worked with him. He was very, very hard to work with because he was terribly demanding, and he was demanding of other people, and he was demanding of himself.
Himself most of all, I think.
I was going to say, he asked more of others than he asked of himself. But that alone was a huge demand. And he was hard on other people, as hard as he was on himself. And that was very hard.
And so people being the object of his temper or his reprimand sort of didn't forget it.
Yeah.
It was a wound that lasted. Did you feel cut by him at all when you were working on him? Did you get a sense that he really could be very sharp?
Oh, goodness, yes. And what was interesting was you would sometimes see this. There are letters. There's a letter he wrote to a critic. He was very, very angry with him about something he'd said about Fiddler on the Roof. It was Walter Kerr, and he wrote him an incredibly snotty note. He was, I think possibly justifiably nettled that Kerr had thought that there was a show busy aspect to Fiddler, and Robbins had tried very hard not to have this. But he was quite intemperate in this. The other thing that was quite fascinating was that at one point he was very annoyed with Arthur Lawrence about
Who wasn't at some point?
And he felt Lawrence had been prevaricating and kind of delaying getting to work on West Side Story. And he wrote him a quite cranky letter about this. And he sent it to him. But he sent it to him after he'd edited it. It was the most fascinating things because I found the letter in Lawrence's files at the Library of Congress in the version that was sent. But I found the original letter, the carbon copy of the original, in Robbins's files with Robbins's pen and ink corrections, things he cut out, things where he, said, "Don't say this, it will just make him angry." And you could see that when he wanted to, when he needed to get something out of somebody to achieve a desired result, he could be temperate, he could be diplomatic, or less intemperate and less undiplomatic than he would be otherwise. So
did you, Amanda, did you get any sense that he knew he had provoked some very negative reactions in people? I actually got to know Arthur Lawrence a little bit, and he said to me, he said, "I know my reputation." He said, "I know what people say about me." He was aware.
And Robbins,
was Robbins aware of it?
And he says, at one point, there's a diary entry that you may have seen, and I think this was in the 1980s, and he writes, I'd like to be good for somebody, good for somebody. You can tell there's a feeling that people don't always like him, and he's sad about that. He would like not to be hurtful. He didn't want to hurt people, and he did. And I don't think he wanted to do that. And you can, in moments like that diary entry, you see his regret, but he didn't seem to be able to help himself. One of the things about him that, and again, you see this over and over in this book, I think, he had an absolutely fatal sense of candor. There was like no holding anything back. And he would say things like, in his high school composition for English, he included his high school diary, including all kinds of sort of snotty things he said about other people in the class. And he's writing about this because he's writing, the composition was called Masks, and it was about masks that you wear in public and how you change your behavior depending on who you're talking to. And, which is, of course, exactly what high school kids think about all the time. What's fake? What is Holden Caulfield if not obsessed with this stuff? But this is a very Holden Caulfield-y kind of a diary entry, but he lets the teacher see every horrible thing he ever said about anybody. And you think, my God, couldn't you just shut up once in a while? But he couldn't.
What your wonderful book does prove, and in certain points, it's actually almost heart-stopping, where he's shown to be capable of enormous compassion. When his dear friend, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Tanaquil Leclerc is diagnosed with polio. His friendship toward her, expressed in the letters, is full-hearted, uncompromising, but totally open, really incredibly moving. It can't come from a person who was only mean. He wasn't only that. He obviously had this other side, incredibly generous and kind.
Very much, and that I think comes through in those. I took a long section. He wrote dozens, literally, letters to her when she was stricken with polio in the 1956 tour of City Ballet to Europe, and she was in iron lung in a hospital in Copenhagen. And he wrote her every day and sent letters, special delivery, so she'd get them right away. And the first letter of these that she got, she read in her iron lung and left it on the pillow next to her so she could see it all the time. Something was so heartbreaking just to think about. But you can, all of the things that he tries to do to amuse or entertain her, there's something so lovely and charming about it.
And selfless, selfless.
And I thought this made a wonderful long sort of story, and I just knit them all into one long segment. It's like a connection.
It's incredibly moving, but it's balanced by his compassion for Jesse Gerstein, one of his last lovers who was diagnosed with AIDS. They broke up, and then when Jesse was diagnosed, he came to live with Robbins, and Robbins was extraordinarily kind, and then wrote this incredible letter to Jesse's mother.
Oh yeah, and he nursed Jesse through this thing. That's a very painful segment to read for any of us who went through the AIDS crisis, because it brings it all horribly back to me anyway. And I thought it was important to have all that and to show that he could be that person.
You demonstrated fully. Reading through the book again, I realized how many areas of conflict dominated his life. He was a man that seems to be in conflict throughout. I want to just go through some of them with you because there's reflected so much in the writing. His vacillating position about his Judaism, about his being Jewish. I think he was conflicted about that.
Oh yeah.
Finally, with Fiddler on the Roof, he embraces it fully, and that's almost like a piece for his father. But there were earlier times when he seems to either be ashamed of it or to reject it.
Well, he writes about that, and one of the things that I did when I was putting this book together was that I was using so many different sources for his story, and there is a considerable amount of material that he wrote, autobiographical material in the 70s, 80s, 90s, harking back to his childhood. And a lot of that was written as straight up autobiography. At one point, he actually did think of writing a memoir, and then he channeled it into another form. And in that, he's very upfront about his feelings about Judaism as a child. I mean, he loved all the magic and mystery of it, but he also said that he felt it was a religion full of alien smells and sounds and sort of, it just was too messy for him in his childhood. I think in part because also he wanted so much to fit in, and most of the kids in his school were goys, and he felt like he was just an alien with them. And he wanted to be a nice WASP kid with a WASP name. He didn't want to be Jerome Wilson Rabinowitz, and he hated his name, he hated his religion, he hated everything about it. And there is a scene that he writes about when he was learning Torah for his bar mitzvah, and there's this old tzaddik who would come to the house and teach him he would teach him Hebrew and teach him pronunciation and get him to read. And they're sitting at the dining room table, and all of the neighborhood kids that little Jerry wanted to impress are hanging around outside the window, and they're poking their heads in and jeering at him. And the old man wouldn't notice them. He pretended they weren't there. And as Robin says, he taught me Jewish submissiveness, and he hated that. And that he had so much conflict about this, and it was all associated too with feelings about his father, with whom he had a contentious relationship.
But is it accurate to say, Amanda, that Fiddler on the Roof was sort of a gift to his father, and a kind of reconciliation with his own Jewishness?
Well, I feel that's true. And I think what happened, to be honest with you, is that sometime in the 50s, he was in Europe touring, and his ballet company, Ballets USA, went to Poland, and he tried to make a pilgrimage to his family's old shtetl of Rojanka and it was gone. And he was so moved and horrified and saddened by the loss of all of this that he began thinking about what had been lost and what had been lost from his own life. And as his father got older and weaker, I think he began to feel the need to reconcile with him. And by the time, Fiddler came around in 1965, and really, before, as he came into it, he sent a telegram to Ruth Mitchell, who was a stage manager that he worked with and who he loved very much to work with. And he said to her, I'm doing a musical about our people. And would you come and work with me? And that was it. He suddenly felt that that's what it was. It was a music about our people.
And I think part of the reason that show has had the history it has is there's something very genuine in its treatment of Jewish tradition and Jewish feeling. Only a Jewish person could have made that show, I feel.
True. That's probably true.
That's probably true.
And what is so important, or was important to him, was that it wasn't, in his view, it wasn't a sentimentalized portrait. He wrote an extraordinary note which is in this book, to Patricia Ziprod, who was the costume designer, and he basically tells her, you have to make these costumes should not be pretty. Poverty is not pretty. The golden mists of time, he says, do not make this beautiful for them. These are people who worked hard, and this was a hard life, and you have to show that. Yeah.
And that putting down of sentiment makes it all the more powerful emotionally, because it's not direct and overdone. It's withheld and repressed. Another area of conflict that your book highlights, and I feel it's an area of conflict that never did get resolved, unlike the Judaism, and that is his testimony of naming names during the blacklist period, when, as you account for his absolutely terrifying interviews with Ed Sullivan, who in many ways comes out as the villain so many years later, who threatens him with exposing his homosexuality, Robbins says, if he doesn't cooperate, become a cooperative witness. And I think to save his career and his fear of being outed, he does name names, and I don't think he ever forgave himself.
Well, I think one of the things that comes through in his writing is that the threat to him wasn't even just, if just is a word you can use in this context, it wasn't just the threat of being outed. It wasn't just losing employment opportunities, but it was really, he had forged an identity for himself through his work. His work was the most important thing to him, because it wasn't just work, it was an expression of everything that he cared about. And to be threatened with the loss of that for whatever reason was a truly existential threat to him. And he tried, and I think that you can see that in the letters and other materials in this book. He tried for really 3 years not to testify. He went to Europe in order to avoid being subpoenaed. All of this so that he wouldn't have to name names. In that Ed Sullivan memorandum, which I found, this was the one total mind blower of this book to me, was that I thought I knew absolutely everything about Robbins's history with the blacklist. And I was looking, I needed, in this book, and we haven't talked about kind of how it's constructed, but
we will.
But what I was trying to do was to write, to let him tell the entire story of his own life through all of these various forms, letters and diaries and scenarios and memoir and whatnot. He never spoke of, never wrote about his experience with the blacklist ever, ever, except in the form of this autobiographical theater piece called The Papa Piece, which he worked on and workshopped in the 80s and 90s with Lincoln Center Theater, and which never was produced. And in that play, if you can call it a play, there was a scene that was a trial. It was a trial in which the protagonist, whose name is Jake Witkowitz, or Jake Yakov Witkowitz, and he's called Jake Whitby. You can figure this one out. Is on trial for his life, essentially, by something that looks like the McCarthy committee, but isn't. It's actually it's some kind of Kafkaesque tribunal. And during the course of it, he betrays his own father. So, you get everything in this scene. And I thought, I'll use that scene, which he wrote in many different forms, because Robbins always had many variations for everything he ever did. Any work he did for the theater was done in like 4 or 5 different versions. So I thought I had the right version. And as I was reading it over before I handed the manuscript in, I thought, there's a better version of this scene than the one I put here. I want to use that. So I went back to the library and I was going through all of the scripts for the Papa Piece, of which there were dozens. And in those folders, in the library's collection of Robbins's archives, there was something I had never seen before. It was a little sheaf of foolscap paper typed up. And I thought, I wonder what this is. I've never seen this. And I pulled it out. And it was a 30-page memorandum that Robbins had written to his own file after he'd had this interview with Sullivan and Theodore Kirkpatrick, the editor of the Red Baiting Rag, not Red Channels, it was Counterattack. And he wrote the whole thing up so that he would remember in case he needed it for a lawyer. As it turned out, I don't think he ever used it, but when he went to write the Papa Piece, he must have gone and unearthed this document and looked at it for use in writing the Papa Piece, and then filed it with all those scripts, and I never found it until when I was working on this. And out it came. It was a terrible moment for him. He never, ever forgave himself, as you say, for having, as he said, betraying his people.
And it was something he couldn't resolve. Lots of things he does resolve, but that one couldn't get resolved.
Not really. And I think he tried to. You can see him trying to in his diaries. You can see him trying to in the pages of the Papa Piece. The one thing, I'm going to look at my own. At the very end of the Papa Piece, he has a scene where he and the father are together on stage. And this was the ending that he wanted to write. And the father says, "Kvetch, kvetch, kvetch. Is that all there is to it? So I read dirty magazines." This is the things that he's holding against his father. "I never ever stood up to your mother. I couldn't speak English. I didn't play sports. I never tried to be a model for you. But did I have fun? Was life good? Oh, you poor thing. Such a woeful tale you fetch out. This they did, that they did, family, friend, and foe. No, give me a break, kid. Give us a break. Give yourself a break. Drop it. It's past. It's over. Now leave me be. Let me rest. Stop haunting me, you, the living." And that's,
Yeah.
That's him. That's the closest he ever got to forgiving himself, was letting his father in this scenario say, forget about it.
he couldn't say it. It was like a benediction from his father. Yeah. Another area of conflict that interested me very much. I don't know if you'd call it conflict, but his career went back and forth between ballet and Broadway. He had George Balanchine as a model for that, but I wonder, to what extent did he feel conflicted? Was he drawn more to one than the other? He was an innovator in both fields. After all, Fancy Free was something extraordinarily new in the world of dance, and then he was an extraordinary practitioner of the musical theater. So, but he goes back and forth, and then something happens, all tied together here. After Fiddler, he never does another original Broadway musical. In fact, appears on Broadway only once in a show that closed in 10 days, The Office, a straight drama. And then we never see him again on Broadway until the retrospective Jerome Robbins Broadway. Why did he cut off that flourishing Broadway career?
Well, there's a letter to Tanakil Leclerc, which he wrote in the 50s. And actually, he wrote it during a time when he was hiding out in Europe from trying to not get subpoenaed by the McCarthy Committee. And she gets very grouchy with him, and well, she often did. And she has let him have it for hiding out in Europe. Why doesn't he come home? And also, and while she's about it, she says, why are you always doing all these Broadway shows? Why don't you, you're such a talented choreographer for ballet. Why aren't you doing that more often? And he says to her, I like doing shows. I think they make me do better ballets, and I think my ballets make me do better shows. I like doing both of them. And he did like doing both. He kind of cross roughs like a, you know, bridge player back and forth between them. And the one really does help the other. And you can see, if you look at the work, the Broadway work and the ballet work, you can see ways in which each piece feeds the other one. There's, you know, wonderful Asian kind of movement in King and I, and then you see that in The Cage, or, you know, there's other stuff like that that goes on and on and on.
But then the dialogue stops at a certain
point. Then in 65, well, then there's Fiddler. And at that point, bear in mind, the musical theater in America is starting to change. And it's becoming a little different. That's one thing. The other thing that's happening is that Robbins did a production of Mother Courage with Anne Bancroft. And I've included in this book a long sort of diary that he wrote of his work on that show. And one of the things that he talks about in this diary is his horrible sense of frustration at how hard it is to get any work done in the commercial theater. You have to have this producer, that producer, you have to have, you know, the kinds of things, the compromises that you have to make. It's like trying to steer an aircraft carrier, and he gets tired of it. He is tired. And
does he feel he has more control in the ballet world?
That was it. And he said right after Fiddler, the first thing, he thought he was going to do a musical of with Leonard Bernstein and Betty Comden and Adolph Green, of Skin of Her Teeth by Thornton Wilder. And the whole thing fell through amid some acrimony, I think, with everybody saying, oh, it's your fault that it didn't happen. Oh, it's your fault that it didn't happen. It just happens all the time with colleagues, much as we love them. And he said to Sheldon Harnick at that point, he was talking to on the street one day, and Sheldon asked him, what are you going to do next? And Robbins said, you know, Sheldon, I don't think I'm going to do anything for a while, or maybe ever. It's so hard just trying to get what I see in my head onto a stage. I don't know if I have the energy to do this anymore. So he started working in an experimental theater group that he founded called American Theater Lab, for which he won one of the first NEA grants. And none of that work ever got on stage either, I think because he realized it couldn't. And he went back to do what was just meant to be a short little ballet for a gala at City Ballet. He had not done any work for them since 1956 when Canicule Leclerc got polio. And he went back to just do this, what he thought was going to maybe be a pas de deux to Chopin. And it grew and it grew and it grew and it became Dances at a Gathering. And it was a huge success. And he suddenly thought, if I do just this, I can do what I have in my head. It was an institutional theater. It was not, you have to remember there were no nonprofit theaters at the time that he sort of gave up on Broadway. There was nothing that was not a commercial theater. There was no place where you could do work that was chancy, unless if you couldn't get a lot of backing, you couldn't get it on the stage. And he was tired of doing that. At City Ballet, you didn't ever have to worry about that. You could have an idea and just do it and nobody cared. You could do this, music from a Pan Am commercial, which is something that Balanchine did, and nobody cared. They just, they all applauded.
You had more creative freedom and more autonomy.
Huge creative freedom, huge autonomy. And he was able to produce organically integrated work there that he just felt he couldn't do on Broadway.
But I still feel that his leaving after Fiddler is a loss to the literature of the Broadway theater. Because what he did create, there aren't all that many shows, but what he did create, West Side Story and Funny Girl, these are extraordinary highlights of the American theater, the American musical theater.
It shows that he did a lot of he did choreography for, but he also thought through very carefully. I mean, there's King and I, for instance, where something so interesting, there's one of the other discoveries, and that was maybe my other big discovery. He had made a dictaphone tape that I didn't find until I was working on this book, that was sent via Leland Hayward to Rodgers and Hammerstein, actually to Oscar Hammerstein, in which he talks about his vision for The King and I, and he was just to do the dances. In fact, he was only supposed to do one dance. He was supposed to just do this court ballet that became Small House of Uncle Thomas. But he has an idea for the whole way that movement should work in the entire show. And that ended up being true. And he ended up doing a whole lot more choreography for it. But it wasn't just the choreography, it was the way everybody moved. It was, he says in this letter, how the people in the court have to have so much dignity. They have to have this is an old kingdom, and they have to have the feeling of that with everything they do. And you realize this is a man, every time he thought about a play, or a show, he didn't think about just doing some kind of divertissement dance. He thought about how it fit into the whole vision of the.
And what was fascinating, and there's a little bit of it in the book, I wish there were more, he was a choreographer with a deep commitment to acting. So his dancers were actors. They had to be actors, and he really treated them as if they were members of the Actors Studio. And I didn't realize he was an original member of the Actors Studio. He was trained in the method.
That's where he met Montgomery Clift, one of his famous.
At the studio.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, but he then uses that approach in his Broadway shows. So it's not dance for the sake of dance. It's dance for creating characters and drama and furthering the story.
Yeah, and he always used to say to his dancers, even at City Ballet, where Balanchine would tell the dancers, don't act, dear, he would say to the dancers. And Robbins would say to them, you should know who you're dancing to. And it doesn't mean the audience, he meant the other person and on stage, your partner. Who is that person? What is your relationship to that person?
He was a great show doctor, and was there more material that he had to say about shows that he came in to save than you include in the book? I would love to know all the background of Funny Girl, for instance.
Oh yeah, well there isn't too much. What there is his relationship with Funny Girl was lengthy because it was
He kept dropping out of it. He kept dropping out.
Oh yeah. Well, Robbins never wanted to be, have a gun held to his head. Like, we're opening next season. And if he saw the script and he said, this script is for shit, we're not doing this. He was very fond um, of the writer for the book writer for Funny Girl, Isabel Leonard, with whom he shared a blacklist experience because she too had been um, caught in the McCarthy net. And so I think they had a certain sympathy for one another. And he was just lovely to her. And yet, as much as he loved her, and he did, and as fond as they were of each other, and as fond as the letters are that he writes to her, he would turn right around and say, this script is terrible right now. It is no good. It is not working. And I'm not going to sign on and say, I'm going to direct this. It's not ready. And then, the producers would say, well, we have to do it. So they would go ahead.
He kept dropping out, and then he comes on and saves the show. But opening night, it's directed by Garson Kanin, entire production under the supervision of Jerome Robbins. Well, you have to know there are problems with that kind of billing. There have been a lot of backstage problems.
Well, and there were, and unfortunately, what I don't have, what I didn't put in here, because sometimes I just think, well, too much inside baseball. There were a lot of letters between him and Ray Stark, who was one of the producers, about what had to be done to the show before he could say he would direct it. And then there were a whole lot of letters to Ray Stark.
No. For us Broadway babies, Amanda, that would not have been too much inside information. Too much is never enough.
In your, I guess, and hey, Vicki, wherever you are, I'm sure you would not have minded if I put it, but I kept thinking this book has to be, it can't be 8,000 pages long. It can only be a certain length. So there's
I would have welcomed that. He was a genius play doctor.
Yeah, he was.
Brilliant. He saved so many shows, but we don't get all the salvation in his letters.
Of course, that's the stuff that he's not going to be writing down. He's actually just going to go on there and say it. What I did try to show was how he looked at it, how he did look at a show. There's a memo that he wrote to going out of my mind here, George Abbott, who was the director of Pajama Game. And
many other shows that he choreographed.
But this is in particularly about Pajama Game. Robbins was the associate director on that show. And he wrote a long letter to Abbott, which I cut because it is very long. But I put in a lot of it, telling Abbott all the things that he thinks are wrong with the show on the eve of the opening in New Haven. He says, this has to go, this has to go, this is what's wrong with this is what's wrong with that. And it is, I think, just brilliant in terms of looking at something and saying, with laser-like focus, this is how you make a show work. There are too many people who all look like this and sound like that. You should only have one of them. We don't understand why so-and-so is singing this song. Why is that happening? All of that kind of stuff. He's really smart. When he's writing letters to Arthur Lawrence and to Leonard Bernstein, particularly to Lawrence, about West Side Story, and Lawrence has sent him a script and he's reading it and he says, no, you can't do this, you can't do, here are the things that you can't do. You cannot have 3 acts. People are gonna just leave. It's got 1 act. And then he says at one point, you were writing this in legit play tempo. This is not a legit play. You've got to make this faster. This is poetry. It has got to be.
It can't stop. It can't stop.
And it has
the momentum goes from beginning to end without a stop.
Absolutely. And then he says at one point, I like best the parts of this play where I hear you writing in your own voice and not with Shakespeare behind you. And this is a great comment. You just think, my God, this man was smart about that stuff. So I try to put in a few things that would let people know this is how he worked.
The creative thought, you get a sense of his creative process, thinking through something. But I want to go and end before we open it to your creative process. how you organized the book, the choices you made. But I have to say, though it's Robbins' voice in the letters and the diaries, and we see lots of his drawings. He was a talented artist, actually. But you're in charge because you do the introduction to each chapter and you have little comments at the bottom of the page where you explain who people are and you insinuate your own point of view. And I was delighted to hear that. You're always there. You're always there. You are in charge. You're the author. He's the writer, but you are the overall director.
Well, I was the director. Yeah, that's it. I felt in a way, this time, Jerry, I'm the director. You're the writer, I'm the director. So.
And you're moving him along at the pace that you set.
Yeah. What I tried to do, Robbins loved collage. And one of the things that's kind of wonderful about, one of the many things that's wonderful about the design of this book and about this fabulous cover that I'm looking at is that the cover uses it is a collage of his collage. He would make notebooks full of collages which he loved. And I thought to myself, this book will be a collage. I will take work from every part of his life and I will put it together in a chronological order so that there is a narrative that is provided. I will have the narrative in my head, but it's not going to be, I'm going to begin with work that he did early and then I'm going to put in work that he did late. It's going to be, I'm going to take work from late that talks about the beginning of his life, and then I'm going to take work from some other point and talk about his school days and so on and so on and so on. So I tried to put this all together in a chronological collage, as it were.
But that tells a narrative. There's a beginning, middle, and end. And the narrative is his life trajectory.
Yes, indeed.
There's the narrative.
I had to explain, I didn't want to interrupt his narrative. So I thought the best way to do that was to organize the book into segments and have introductions that would give the context so that you would know what was going to be happening in the next however many pages so that you wouldn't feel at sea. And then I tried to have footnotes. I never have footnotes.
You annotated a lot in the footnotes. Yeah. You introduce a lot of material. Did you decide which figures needed annotation? I mean,
I did. I mean, I tried to actually err on the side of caution and just put lots of stuff in there, because what's really scary is to reach the age I am and to realize how much people who are younger than I don't know about any of this stuff. And you have to also, I mean, I had to remember, I was a nerdy, sort of theater nerd kid, an arts nerd kid, and I went to the theater and I knew who all these people were. I mean, I knew who Gertrude Lawrence was. I knew who, all these people. And a lot of other people won't know this stuff. And I felt that I needed to explain it so that you wouldn't get hung up. But and equally, I didn't want to have to keep interrupting his narrative with some kind of explanatory inner comments. So I just thought, okay, I'm just going to put everything at the bottom of the page, like a footnote. It will be a footnote, so that if there's something you don't understand, you don't know who this is, there's going to be a note there.
But for those who buy the book, and I urge you all to get it because it's splendid, don't skip the footnotes. There's lots of material. This has been fabulous to talk to Amanda, but Mark, I think we should open it up to the house now.
Yes, I don't have any written questions, so I am going to ask people to unmute if they have a question, and hopefully we won't step on each other. So, any questions? Magda, you got on mute. Magda, you have to unmute.
May I ask her a question or?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Susanna, while we get Magda unmuted.
Amanda,
Yes.
this has been such a treat for me. I've never been a Jerome Robbins fanatic, but given your passion for the man, I'm really hooked. I am going to get the book for sure. And I just wanted to compliment you on your passion because
Anything.
um, it's so inspirational is what I'm trying to say. And I'm wondering, now does he haunt you at all? I mean, do you dream about him? Are the entrails of Jerome interfering with your next project? Or how do you leave him back there and start anew?
Well, I'll tell you 3 things. One of them, I had 2 dreams about Jerry Robbins. One of them was sort of midway through writing his biography, where I dreamt that I was a designer and I was doing a house for him, and I was doing a huge renovation for him, and I was going to make an alteration to his bathroom. It was a country house with a beautiful view of a pasture and meadows and so forth. And I was going to open up the back of the bathroom. It was going to be all glass, and I was going to say, you can just be, and you'll be in your shower, and you can look out, and you'll see everything. He says, "Oh, Amanda, I don't know. I feel a little concerned about. I mean, won't people be able to look in and see me?"
Oh,
And I said, "Don't, Jerry, don't worry about it. You're gonna love it." That was my dream. I can't believe I had a dream like that. But that was the first dream I had about him. The second dream I had about him, and that was a dream that I would have, it was a recurring dream, was that I would pick up the telephone and I would say hello, and at the other end, somebody would say, "Amanda, it's Jerome Robbins."
wow. Wow.
Called me for a while. So I guess he's all right with everything. But I don't, he doesn't influence what I'm doing right now, except in this way. For somebody who had so much trouble writing, who had so much trouble working, who had so much trouble getting work in the way that he wanted it, he was an extraordinary work mentor. And this is a guy who, when Fiddler on the Roof was opening in Detroit and was in terrible, terrible shape, Austin Pendleton approached Robbins at the bar that all the company used to use. Robbins is wearing black and he's dark, undercloudy. It's like people would say, "Don't talk to him when he's like that, don't." But Austin was a kid and he didn't know. He was playing model with Taylor. He's a cute little Austin. And he goes up and he says, "Well, Jerry, we've heard all these terrible things, and coming from New York, they're all the trades are full of bad stuff about the show, and they're all saying terrible stuff about us, and it sounds like it's gonna bomb. What are you gonna do, Jerry?" And Robbins looks and says, "Austin, I'm gonna do 10 things a day. 10 things a day." And to me, that is it. That's how I do.
I missed that line. He said, "Austin, what?"
I'm going to do 10 things a day.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Magda, you had a question?
Well, I have 2 questions. One was after he named names, he had to come back and work with these people. And people like Zero Mostel, who really felt very strongly against him, and yet they had to work together on Fiddler. How was that? Did you get insight to that? And my second question is, how did you come to him? In other words, how did you meet him? Or okay.
Well, with respect to naming names and the people that he's working with, he doesn't write about that so I couldn't use it in this book. I wrote about it in the biography, and I also wrote about it in the screenplay for the documentary, where we interviewed Madeline Lee, who was one of the people. He didn't name her name, but she was named, and I mean, he did name her name. What am I saying? And
that was Madeline Guilford as well.
Madeline Guilford, who was married to Jack Guilford, And before she was married, she's badly, but anyway, um, she never forgave him, not surprisingly. And she was very eloquent about her feelings. And um, I thought it was important, we thought it was important in the documentary to let her speak. We didn't have Mostel, he was dead, so we couldn't ask him to speak. But it was important to let her have her say. Um, is the story goes, and I wrote about this in the biography, that when Robbins came to work on Funny Thing, happened on the way to the Forum, which was starring Mostel, and which Robbins had originally been going to direct and then didn't direct. It was one of these stories, and then was called in to doctor at the last minute. The show was opening in Washington. It was just into disaster shape, and he was called in to fix it and made some legendary changes in it. Apparently, when he was introduced to the cast, who had been warned ahead of time that he was going to be there and he was going to be taking over the show, everybody thought, oh my God, what's going to happen when Jerome Mostel has to speak to him? And Mostel apparently said to him, "Hiya, loose lips," and that was the end of it. You know, that's all he said. They had a sort of a joke. They were not friendly, but Robbins, on the other hand, admired Mostel hugely. And when he was talking to his colleagues about this aborted or abortive Skin of Our Teeth production that he was working on with Betty and Adolph and Lenny Bernstein, the person he wanted to play Mr. Antrobus was Jerome Mostel, because he thought he was a great, great actor. So that's that story. And how do I know, how did I get started on Robbins? I got started on Robbins because I wanted to write about somebody who at the time had not been written about. This was back in, I started that book in 1999, I guess. Who at the time had not been written about, and who had his feet in, his hands in as much of 20th century culture in America as was possible. And this is, you know, here is Robbins, who was in Broadway, was in ballet, who remade the Broadway theater in many important ways, who helped to create an American ballet, who named, so he's part of the McCarthy period, who knew and was friendly with artists in every possible genre in mid-century, and who also played a part in the AIDS crisis and in the whole, I guess I would say, gay liberation, because he did. And I thought those were really important things to write about. And it was amazing to me that there was this figure who, as it turns out, I lived across the street from when I was a child, and whose work I'd always admired, who touched all of those, he ticked all those boxes. And I just thought, well, I should write about him. So that's how that started. I didn't know him. I just saw him on the street walking his dog.
Do we have any other questions from our viewers?
Say one thing, Mark, about how difficult it was told that he was? Or maybe I can't. Whatever.
Yeah, she talked about that.
No, I'm just thinking anybody who's got that much genius is obviously he's going to be a perfectionist, and he's going to make enemies. That's not surprising. And the tender side of him shows how human he was and how he could be forgiven for having to be a perfectionist to get where he was.
Well, I've always wondered, you know, David Merrick was not the nicest man.
True.
And nobody goes around saying, oh, David Merrick, what a terrible man. He was. And you read his biography and you just think, oh my God. And actually, to the extent that he worked with Robbins on Gypsy, and he's appalling. Just an appalling person.
Oh.
And nobody goes around saying that. You know, they don't go saying, "Oh my God, Native American, what is your?" No, I mean, if you scratch people, they'll tell you. But he was dreadful.
Merrick was,
back,
yes.
I guess it's back to you, Foster.
Yeah, I want just to end with two brief questions. We haven't talked about this, but Amanda, you should know, is a very proud mother because her son Patrick is a very talented actor who played Judd Fry in the recent and brilliant revisionist version of Oklahoma. How is Patrick doing, Amanda? Yeah, he was
Well,
terrific.
he's fine. I mean, he's as well as can be expected, as any actor is at this point, because, you know, there's not a lot of work going around. So he's, you know, he's participating in something that we will all be able to see in a week or so. It's a big, I can't talk too much about it, but it's a compendium of work that a bunch of actors are doing that will be put up on the internet. I mean, or however we call this now. And he filmed a Netflix series called Dash and Lily, which is airing in the fall, later this fall. So that's nice. And, you know, we hope that at some point there will be theater and film and television production starting up again, and you'll be able to get some work done. In the meantime, he's been cooking a lot of Vietnamese food and learning German.
Amanda, tell us about your latest project.
Well, I'm writing a book about the Schuyler sisters, Alexander Hamilton's wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, and her sister Angelica Schuyler Church. And as I say, if you have seen Hamilton, you know a little bit about this story. And to be honest, I was first intrigued by them when I read Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, because Hamilton's wife, although many people think of her as this very compliant, supportive, kind of, you know, lovely, sweet, supportive, wifey person, turns out to have been a woman of steel. She lived for 50 years after Hamilton died, and she became essentially one of the first nonprofit executives in America. She co-founded, and ran for many years the first orphanage in New York. She founded a free school in way up in northern Manhattan, where she lived. She became kind of a congressional lobbyist. She got Hamilton's papers collected and his biography written, and she did a bunch of other things. And she was a quite extraordinary figure. And I thought, well, she needs to be written about. Her sister, who Hamilton had a heavy flirtation with, if not more, married a wealthy Englishman who had actually helped the American cause during the war, which is how she met him. And she went to live in England for a while and became a kind of international mover and shaker. You know, think, I don't know, Pamela Harriman, avant la lettre, only thinner and littler and dark, not blonde. And I thought these two women are so interesting and nobody knows anything about them. Why don't I sort of investigate their lives? And the more I started to think about them, the more I became fascinated with the way women in those years are living sort of in the interstices of history. History happens, they don't actually affect it in obvious ways, but they do. And they are living in history, almost in spite of it, making a life for themselves. And I found their lives completely fascinating the more I found out about them. So anyway, that's what I'm writing now.
Do you have a title?
I do, I think, but
You don't want to share it.
I'll keep it secret for now.
Okay. Well, we can talk about this title. Folks, this is a fabulous book. You can tell from what we've been talking about that Amanda knows her subject. It's a terrific book. Jerome Robbins by himself, not entirely an accurate title, Jerome Robbins by himself with the help and editorial supervision of Amanda Vail. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Mark.
Your book is wonderful. Your book is wonderful.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you all.
And also thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for your wonderful interview. We have no events scheduled next week, but we do have on Monday a special event that'll be head up by the Lambs historian. Howard Chandler Christie was a member of the Lambs, and we have quite a few paintings. And James Head, who's written several books about Christie, will talk about him. And on Tuesday, Magda, why don't you introduce our guests?
Yes, we're going to have James Barber, the fabulous singer and actor. And then the next night, we're going to have Julia Mills, the actress and movie star. And we'll have Foster back with that. And thank you, Mark, for everything. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Foster. Wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thanks.
And as a final pitch, to remember that this video will be up tomorrow afternoon on the Lambs website, which is www.thelambs, which is hyphenated.org. It's on the website is on the email you received. Also, your little donations help us to keep these things going, so that's appreciated if you are able to do so. And once more, let's give a big thank you to Amanda, our guest.
Thank you.
And now go buy the book.
Will do.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye.
Mark.